After the hour, so let's start it.
Take it away, Susan.
Okay, so welcome everybody from all of the places that you are tuning in from, and please put in the chat your name and where you're from. We are so pleased to have Norman Solomon here tonight. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Norman Solomon. Just a little bit about him. He is an American journalist, media critic, author, and activist. He's the founder of the Institute for Public Accuracy, a IPA's executive director and the coordinator of its Expose Facts program. He's the co-founder and national director of the online organization rootsaction.org, which I hope all of you tune in on. And if there are those of you who are new to this, please look up Roots Action. They have absolutely wonderful, both wonderful programs and events and things that are of interest for you to go online, good petitions. Norman Solomon was elected as a Bernie Sanders delegate in the 2016-2020 Democratic National Convention, where he was a coordinator of the Independent Bernie Delegates Network. In 2012, he ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives from California's 2nd Congressional District and came within 0.1% of getting through the primary. Oh, that you were. This country would be in such a different state. We know him through his work in organizing Defuse Nuclear. He's here tonight to talk about his latest book, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. Norman embodies all that is best about the peace movement. Norman.
Well, many thanks to everybody making our gathering possible here. Massachusetts Peace Action, which I say to people in other states, is really a national leader in not only analyzing our problems, but organizing to address them directly and clearly. And so to Susan and Brian and everybody at Massachusetts Peace Action, I just want to say thank you. We, of course, are facing tremendous obstacles to creating any sort of progress in our society and in our world right now. And what I'd like to do is first talk a bit about the information and analysis in the book War Made Invisible, which has just come out in the last few weeks, and then move ultimately to the crucial challenges ahead, which is to create the change, to analyze past and present history and create better history, if you will, for the future. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that everything positive about public policy in this country was made possible because people organized. None of it was ever given by the powerful to the less powerful. And so as we look at the current situation, there's often a tendency, certainly from the mass media, to suggest that if we can simply find the right few leaders or support a particular political party, then that is our breakthrough. Nothing in history really indicates that, quite the contrary. Writing a book can be really difficult and really challenging, and I found that to be true in working on and finishing up War Made Invisible. It's not nearly as difficult as organizing. And I say that as somebody who's been involved in a lot of writing and a lot of organizing, that there was so much messaging from the mass media, from political figures, to encourage passivity politically, to assume that political action involves voting only, and that our voices mean little otherwise, that from the media, the main thing is we do other than vote is to go out and buy things. It's a consumer culture. It's a culture teaching us to be passive. And yet, as AIDS activists said in the 1980s, silence equals death, and never more so than with the nuclear Armageddon shadow hanging over us, arguably more than in any other time in our lifetime, certainly as much as any other time. And yet the denials is extremely powerful. So invisibility and denial go hand in hand. We live in a warfare state. The crimes of the Russian government in Ukraine are self-evident. There's no point in soft pedaling or watering down the analysis that there are war crimes being committed by the Russian government every day. At the same time, history, past and present, has to matter. We have to make it matter and put it into a sharp context. It's a roadmap for where we've been, where we are, and the terrain where we've headed. And in this century, the government, by far, the most responsible for slaughtering people directly and indirectly through warfare is the United States of America. That is simply a reality that is filtered out by our mass media. I'd have to say, not all that often mentioned in a lot of corporate or liberal media. It's an inconvenient fact that the warfare state that we live in, propelled by massive profits of corporate capitalism, this is a system that is designed to make profit off of death. We live in a death culture. It is more so than ever. The fact is that when there were so-called many troops, boots on the ground during the opening many years of this century, then there was a lot of profiteering from that process. We used to say, even in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War, sardonically and angrily, war is profitable, invest your son. And that was also to some degree a fitting statement during the first years of the so-called war on terror, but increasingly the boots on the ground are substituted for by high technology, the pretense of being above it all, the tacit belief, at least propagated or unconscious assumption, that somebody with a suicide belt is a terrorist who killed civilians, but somebody who uses a technology from Boeing or Northrop Grumman is the opposite, when in fact the results are largely the same. One of the aspects of War Made Invisible that is really, I think, in intentional, attempted sharp focus anyway, is this pretense that US warfare is somehow humane. And lest that sound like it's not very common assertion, I take apart a book by a Yale University professor with that name, Humane, got a claim, and when it was published a couple of years ago. This is a way of our society preening ourselves and reassuring ourselves that we're not so terrible after all, and in fact, US militarism has a benign aspect to it, or even benign intentions. And so at the start of the 21st century, there was a lot of talk about responsibility to protect what Noam Chomsky referred to in a 1999 book as the new military humanism. And that was the pretense involved. And yet now the excuses have changed, but the tremendous profiteering of the Pentagon contractors has continued to ratchet upward. Every year, the Pentagon budget is not a defense budget. It's lowercase d, often we're told, defense budget. It's never appropriately been called a lowercase d defense budget. It's a military budget. And as it goes through the roof, the bipartisan cheerleading for it continues. As a matter of fact, I note in the book that around the time of the celebration of the Prince of Peace in late December, the presidents, including Biden, ceremoniously sign in the Oval Office the military budget to help kill more people. There's a quote at the beginning of the book from Thomas Merton, and he wrote it concluding a poem in the face of a Nazi commandant. And he wrote, "Do not think yourself better because you burn up friends and enemies with long-range missiles without ever seeing what you have done." What the US warfare state does is to engage in that kind of activity and assure us that these are moral actions and that unfortunately sometimes civilians die, but that's neither the intention nor the foreseeable result. In fact, as I write in War Made Invisible, and this is simply one other layer of the invisibility of US wars to the US public, what's done in our names with our tax dollars, the predictable effects of US wars have been to kill civilians on a regular basis. The so-called war on terror has been characterized by killing civilians directly and indirectly. Brown University's Costs of War project has done a very conservative estimation that I cite in the book of the toll of the so-called war on terror since October of 2001. And it's pretty close to 400,000 civilians directly killed and a total of about 950,000 directly killed. I emphasize directly because the project points out that for every death that is directly attributable to this, quote, war on terror, there have been several indirect deaths, destruction of infrastructure, environment, housing, healthcare, you name it. So we're looking at several million people who've died in ostensible response to the crime of 9/11 that killed 3,000. How can that be? Of course, it's profitable. Of course, the propaganda system is in overdrive 24/7, 365 to tell us that while the US makes mistakes and errors, that somehow it is all for the global good. One rationale, which is tacit or explicit, is that the Pentagon never intends to kill civilians. It just happens unfortunately. And there are a lot of layers of that, which I write about in the book. One is, to take an example, when Dick Cheney went to the floor of the House 18 months ago to support his daughter for opposing Trump, the Democratic leader, Nancy Pelosi, publicly proclaimed that they were honored to have Dick Cheney visit the House floor. You're honored to have a war criminal. Well, I mean, if Putin is a war criminal, and he is, so is Dick Cheney. And so is George W. Bush. I can't find a single editorial from a major newspaper that routinely calls Putin a war criminal using that description for Cheney or Bush. And given a lot that is in evidence, it could at least arguably be attached to our last few presidents since George W. Bush as well. I use the analogy, and given how predictable this death toll has been and continues to be with the US involved in military actions directly in Syria, in Somalia, a lot of special ops we're not even told about. What does it mean to say these killings were not intentional? I mean, let's think about that. After 9/11, essentially, Congress and the president gave the United States government a political license to kill whenever and wherever it chose necessary to work its will on the world. But let's say in Boston or San Francisco or any other city or town in the United States, the authorities, the armed police, decided that when they're going to chase criminals and they think the criminals might be in a store or in a home or in some other facility, a school, that the authorities used firepower to spray the plate glass windows with machine gun fire, drop bombs occasionally. And of course, there'd be many civilians killed, and yet the pretense could always be, oh, that was a mistake. We didn't mean to do that. Well, how would that go over? The do as we say, not as we do precept is very powerful, but it's tacit, it's unspoken. And that certainly applies to the geopolitical conflicts that we're struggling with right now, whether the group is Roots Action or Massachusetts Peace Action or many other hundreds of groups or thousands are in some way having to encounter a political terrain that deals with the aggression of Russia on Ukraine. And there's no justification for what Russia's doing. There is an explanation. And if we were to assume that the United States doesn't have the prerogative, and this would be a leap of imagination for most mass media in the United States, if we're to assume that the United States doesn't have the prerogative to do whatever it wants and then preach to the rest of the world something else, then they're very simple tests. In Romania and in Poland right now, there are ABM systems, and they're called defensive, but even Radio Free Europe, and I quote in the book, Radio Free Europe reported that those ABM systems can very easily be retrofitted to be offensive missiles, and they're really not far from the Russian border. Of course, Estonia and Latvia, formal members of NATO, are on the Russian border. So let's imagine that Russia, as a nation, a government that is not getting along with the United States, had a military pact with, say, Canada, and put missile systems along the US-Canadian border. The question sort of answers itself. Would the United States government tolerate it? We need only remember the Cuban Missile Crisis to get that answer. So the assumption, the precept that is so operative in US media is, and on Capitol Hill, of course, is that the United States should do whatever it can and will to work its will on the world, including militarily, and that when the US can get away with something, it should be able to do it, because after all, when we make mistakes, but the intentions are good. If you go back in the archives, you can find the only one of two members of the US Senate voting against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, saying that the United States, he says this explicitly, the United States policy is might makes right. He said out loud what is usually not said out loud. And even said, it's just as wrong when we do it, in his words, as when the Russians do it, which has a real echo now. There's was a very popular bumper sticker that was red, white, and blue. And it was used by people who felt very much in favor of US warfare. And the bumper sticker, red, white, and blue, says, these colors don't run. And there was a peace group that printed up a red, white, and blue bumper sticker in response, and it said, these colors don't run the world. Well, that's a really difficult concept to sell to US media, to politicians in Washington, and yet it's absolutely crucial. What goes around comes around. The violence of the 9/11 wars has many ripple effects, including back at home. The COVID pandemic, the climate emergency, in so many ways, the idea that the United States is singularly entitled, singularly virtuous, it doesn't pass the tragic laugh test, and yet it is routine currency, and it's currency that we have to challenge and devalue and insist is not acceptable. One of the big barriers to deconstructing and demolishing this very dangerous set of attitudes is the Republican Party. And another big obstacle is the Democratic Party. I believe there are huge differences between the two parties on domestic policies, and the threat of fascism is very real. At the same time, when you get beyond the water's edge, the attitudes, other than climate policy, for instance, the differences in attitudes shrink almost to the vanishing point. We're facing now a bipartisan militarism of enormous consequence, very little dissent. Arguably on Capitol Hill, the discourse and debate is narrower on military and foreign policy than perhaps in any time for decades. And as analysts, as journalists, as activists, as people who do not want to consume history like Wonder Bread off the shelf, we have not only the opportunity, but really a responsibility to inform ourselves and others, to analyze, and to organize effectively and directly challenge both outside and inside the lobbying and electoral system. I think overall, when it comes to foreign policy, the relationships between progressives and progressive groups and, say, the leadership and a lot of members of the Progressive Caucus in Congress, I think it's a very unhealthy relationship. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about a phenomenon that he identified with some of the establishment leaders of the civil rights movement during the late 1950s and into the 1960s. He said that these leaders of movements, they are supposed to be a representative of the movement to the establishment, but routinely they end up being a representative of the establishment to the movements. And that not only is true of some disarmament groups, unfortunately, in some cases, in terms of the US militarism vis-a-vis NATO, includes heavy hitter, funder, and advocacy group like Plowshares. But it's also true, unfortunately, of many members of the leadership of the Congressional Progressive Caucus who have done many wonderful things. They do great advocacy and work on domestic issues, but they're in the military band. They're playing their instruments when it comes to this crisis with Ukraine, which needs diplomacy. And whether it's Massachusetts Peace Action or some other groups, there's been leadership from the grassroots saying, diplomacy cannot be a dirty word in this conflict. And yet that is the prevailing dominant view that we're dealing with right now, that somehow there has to be a fight to the death without projecting out, what does that mean? What does it mean to say Ukraine must defeat Russia? Well, the silent part was said out loud by uppercase D Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin when he said that the U.S. should weaken the military of Russia. Biden twice said, after the first time his aides tried to, quote, walk it back, Biden as president twice said that there needs to be regime change in Russia. Can you imagine? This is the mentality that we're dealing with. And we're encouraged to believe that there's some shred or dominant effect and attitude of humanity, of humanism, of decency, of regard for human beings in U.S. foreign policy. That's been, I think, in a very specific way refuted by the decision of the Biden administration in the last couple of weeks to send cluster munitions to Ukraine. In War Made Invisible, I devote several pages to war munitions. The United States used 1.2 to 2 million bomblets in its first few weeks of the invasion of Iraq. I think I don't need to emphasize the point of just how inhumane these weapons are, children still picking them up as toys and having their bodies shredded. Well, when, as I point out in the book, Russia invaded Ukraine and from the outset began using cluster munitions, that was rightly, correctly condemned by the White House, by Congress, by US news media. And now in the last few weeks, fast forward almost a year and a half later, When the US is supplying those weapons, those very same weapons to Ukraine, it's A-OK. It's fine. What does that tell us? I think it tells us a couple things, that for the umpteenth example, when you have a willingness of governments to do whatever it can propagandistically to sell its policies at any one time, it's very much like doublethink in 1984. Have a fact or assertion on the shelf, take it off the shelf whenever convenient, utilize it, put it back on the shelf, and then pretend that it doesn't exist. And when we look at the coverage, and I have headlines in the book from the New York Times, where the readers are told in bold headlines, I think I could find it here, where the use of these weapons by Russia is just so horrible. I mean, it just should be condemned. And these were banner front page, all capital headlines of the type we rarely see in the New York Times. So here's a couple of examples. It's in a chapter titled Over the Horizon. The first day of March 2002, you go to the New York Times homepage, and there's a huge headline in all capital letters: "Rocket barrage kills civilians." Well, of course, that could have been a headline for the US effects in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq, but no, we didn't have any headlines like that in the New York Times or any other mass media. But we had it when the Russians did what they did. Now, I want to hasten to say that hypocrisy in the US government in no way justifies what Russia's doing, but also what Russia's doing in no way justifies not only US hypocrisy, but the record of killing through so many means, directly and indirectly, hundreds of thousands into the millions of people in this century, as Brown University's Costs of War project has documented. And the almost seamless relationship between US media and the policymakers and ratifiers in Washington, it's so insidious because they keep recycling each other's messaging. I want to give one more example, which I think brings it into focus. 40 days after the Russian invasion began of Ukraine, the New York Times print edition had at the top of the front page, in all capital letters, and I'm quoting here, "Horror grows over slaughter in Ukraine." Of course, the article under it is all about what Russia is doing. "Horror grows over slaughter in Ukraine." Can you imagine a headline in the New York Times in, say, 2003 or any time in years since then about the US military actions in Iraq or Afghanistan? Horror grows over slaughter in Iraq. It just wouldn't happen. It's inconceivable that would happen. Well, I want to sort of wind down here and ask for questions and comments. I want to close with one of the main themes of the book that I really felt has gotten really very rare attention and is really crucial. And that is that, as I put it, US policy and media and propaganda have divided humanity into two categories, two sets of people, one of which has grief that really matters, a tier of grief that really matters. Americans, designated allies, and people who are at the end of firepower of designated US enemies. And then there's another tier of grief, the unpersons, those whose grief doesn't matter. We don't hear about, we don't get the empathetic coverage or rhetoric about, people who are at the other end of US firepower. And that is corrosive. You might, depending on your preferred orientation, call it ethically or morally or spiritually corrosive. Very much so, undermines the very basis not only of discourse, but you could say just who we are as a society, maybe as people as well. A few of the most important pages of the book, and I'll close with this and look forward to questions, comes near the end. It's a set of quotations from Daniel Ellsberg. When I sat with him on the deck next to his house in the hills in the Bay Area, the beautiful, looking over the shimmering San Francisco Bay. And Dan spoke in complete paragraphs. There's really no need to edit particularly. And he talked about what happened after 9/11, where the New York Times did an extraordinary journalistic task. They found pictures of virtually all 3,000 of the people who'd been killed on 9/11. And they had little thumbnail pictures of each one. They had researched, as Dan put it, something that conveyed that they were special humans. They were loved by some people. They, as he said, one liked to skydive, one liked to play golf, one was a musician, a singer, whatever. And then Dan went on to say he thought about what happened during the so-called shock and awe, where the United States threw such an enormous number of destructive firepower into the capital city of Baghdad, size of a city of Atlanta or Houston. And Dan said that, and I think this is a profound point, that the New York Times could have done something very similar after the regime fell in Iraq. The Times could have researched who had died as a result of the US attack, could have found pictures, could have given a little thumbnail narration to present each of those individuals as real people. But as Dan pointed out, it didn't happen. It wouldn't happen. It's unimaginable that it could happen. That's because of the depth of corruption of the propaganda system of the United States.
Norman, thank you so much for this presentation. You make this whole issue of what we hear and what we understand to be very, it's accessible, and you make it very human. So thank you for you. Thank you for your thinking. Thank you for your book. We'll go now to Q&A. And again, you can put your questions into chat. Just put a question heading, or you can raise your hand, and please put your questions in question form. And now I'd like to turn it over to Brian Garvey, the Assistant Director of Mass Peace Action. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Norman, for a fantastic presentation. And I know you're anxious to get to what you said earlier before we actually started this program is your favorite part, which is the question and answer. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to a little further ado. Just a reminder to please keep your questions brief and keep them questions so we can get to as many as possible and so we can get Norman's responses. But with that quick advice, I'm going to pass it over to Louise Coleman, who has raised her hand. And if you want to ask the next question, please go under reaction and use the raised hand feature. Go ahead, Louise.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I was really struck by when you were what we were talking about, the duplicity, and even before you said 1984, I was thinking 1984. The slogans, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. I mean, it's like, and that is what's happening now. But what I'm curious about and wondering what you think about, how do we address that sort of duplicity? How do you, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, it is, I mean, one of the things I think Orwell always did was like really just got to the point immediately. And that's what, like war is peace, freedom is there. And that's not true. And a lot of the things that are like all your quotes from the New York Times, I mean, those things are not true. So how do we challenge that and change that up?
Oh, thanks, Louise. I think that the concentric challenges that we have can sometimes be overwhelming. And I will quote the often quoted Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have tremendous obstacles ahead. And part of it, as you're referring to, is just the framing and the routine. I think that it's so normalized that, and I give an example in the book, and this includes, we internalize a lot of this. Peace advocates will also refer to a defense budget. We don't have a defense budget. We have a military budget. So why give away part of the discourse? That's just a small example. We would call it what it is, a military budget. And it goes across the board. And the propaganda system de facto is much more like gas in the air or water on a stone than some sudden onslaught, although there is an upturn of onslaught where it gets particularly fierce. But the underlying power, I think, derives a lot of itself from just the 24/7, 365. So although it's a daunting task, whether one is a writer, speaker, artist, filmmaker, activist, and or any combination, is likewise, we are needing to be like water on a stone. An analogy I give, and that's why supporting an organization like Massachusetts Peace Action and other groups, and I would include rootsaction.org self-interestedly, is that when there are times of crisis, when there's a flare-up where it becomes really obvious to so many people that there is a crisis, it's really hard to start from a dead stop. I think of the analogy of a train, where if a train isn't moving and then something happens and you want to move it, you're really at a disadvantage when it hasn't been moving all along, even at a slower pace. And that's why ongoing organizations that are around every day of the year are so important. There are going to be times that are seeming to be fallow, not much is happening. Why are we even doing this? Maybe it will come to mind. But it's the maintenance, so to speak, that has to go on. That said, we're in a battle against propaganda. We need a positive, multifaceted approach, and the media is so important. We need to sustain media outlets that are giving counter narratives and information that's being withheld by the military industrial media complex. And we also need to challenge the mainstream. I think, and MAPA has been one of the leading groups to be willing to picket congressional offices, even among our friends in their home districts. We also have the option to picket the newspaper offices, the TV and radio stations. We might encounter the belief, we're trying to challenge their First Amendment prerogatives. No, we're utilizing. They're sitting on the windpipe of the First Amendment through their corporate domination of the news and information flow by raising our voices, by challenging mainstream media, as well as building our own. I think that's really crucial. And then, of course, the organizing component is just absolutely necessary. And I think that has to include challenging a lot of the best members of Congress, because often that's a high jump over a low standard to say they're the best in the House, for instance. One other thing I'll mention is I am not disinterested because I've worked with FAIR from the start. But when it comes to media, if you're not on the email alert list from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which you can sign up for at fair.org, I really recommend you do that, because it is, I think, historically the most powerful long-term media activism group in U.S. history. And it's been around for almost 40 years, and we should really make use of it.
So those alternatives are really, really important, because the mainstream media owns the mainstream media. So we have to work around. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Louise. I just wanted to plug your book, Norman. I just put it in the chat and recommend that everybody go and visit warmadeinvisible.com, where you can buy the book and support Norman's work. But Norman, you just touched on something, but I think you could expand on it as well. Kevin Martin asked in the chat a question, and he'd like to actually come on and ask it live. So I'm going to bring him up right now.
Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Norman. One of the reasons I wanted to ask it is to give you praise for your creativity and versatility and your leadership and the breadth of your work over so long now.
Thank you.
I really want to give you that appreciation. So what I put in the chat, and this actually has to do with something we're going to talk about. A number of us are going to gather in New Hampshire at a retreat of peace action activists next week. It's sort of assessing the state of our organization and also the movement. Is historically, I think, I didn't used to agree with this, but I do now. I think it is useful historically and also to assess what we need to do going forward. What's the difference between a peace movement or an anti-militarism movement that is sustained versus more short-term or ephemeral anti-war movements? And I think people sometimes confuse the two. The anti-war movements in response to horrible, heinous wars, Vietnam and Iraq, the Central America Solidarity Movement in response to the awful policies of the United States towards Central America, the anti-apartheid movement, the nuclear freeze movement in response to the nuclear threat, are inflection points and rises in movements that are just impossible to sustain, at least in our observed history and experience. So that ongoing peace or anti-militarism work is always much more difficult and much smaller. And a lot of you on this call, I know you know this because you've been involved in a long time. And the fact that you're on this call tonight means that you are part of the smaller cadre that sustains that movement, even when there isn't something as obviously horrible as Vietnam or Iraq. What U.S. foreign policy is horrible all the time, but not as obvious to the rest of the world. So if we take that as a given, what does that mean in terms of how do we sustain ourselves? Where do we get maybe smaller victories like helping to end the war in Yemen, which is not really a small victory because we helped end a war, hopefully, that 400,000 people died in, but that most people don't even know about, and they wouldn't think that there's a big movement, and there isn't a big movement. I would say sustaining ourselves with some of those efforts where we can have a greater impact than we maybe can on other things, and also working to make cross-sectoral connections with other movements, environmental movement, anti-racism work, et cetera. So I just wondered on your sort of historical analysis, if that's sort of in line with how I've characterized it.
Yeah, what you said, Kevin, really resonates for me in terms of what happens over a period of years and decades. And without being sort of reductionist about it, part of it is a money issue because we're up against, I forget the figures, but you look at the Pentagon budget and you look at all the peace groups in the country budget, and it is enough to make you cry. We really need more stable funding, which is a truism, and I don't mean to just toss it off, but that really helps to have the infrastructure. And without oversimplifying, sometimes funders, tacitly or not, do have restraint effects, and we just need to find more ways to have funding that are not constraining in terms of really willingness to directly challenge the establishment, the warfare state directly. Being independent of the two parties in terms of activism, really crucial. And the Biden administration has really caused some people, I think, to mistakenly interpret the situation as more benign. And yet you look at it and they rush towards nuclear war, arguably. That's a mistake. And you're absolutely correct that reaching out in terms of other groups, other concerns, constituencies, as the saying goes, intersectionality, all important, difficult in part, I believe, because of the blinders that are acculturated for a lot of movements. I just give, two examples. One is the climate movement. It's very rare to hear any mention of nuclear winter. The effect of nuclear war, as Dan Ellsberg points out in his brilliant book, The Doomsday Machine, substantial nuclear war resulting in nuclear winter, destruction of agriculture, about 99% of humanity destroyed in less than a year. So that's pretty chilling, no pun intended, pretty chilling nuclear winter, pretty chilling climate change. And yet I've emailed with some, the most famous US leaders on climate. They really don't want to deal with it for whatever reasons, either affirmative misleading statements like the nuclear threat has diminished, or I think maybe that it's seen as a diversion, and that's just a mistake, and it could be a terrible mistake of terrible results. The other is about racism. And I have a whole chapter in War Made Invisible, which parenthetically, whether or not you buy one, please ask your local library to stock it. There's a whole chapter called Color of War. And it was some time into working on this book that a fact really jumped out at me. If you go from US war beginning in October of 2001, the entire so-called trademarked war on terror, almost every victim of US firepower has been a person of color. It's a hidden in plain sight. And I point out in the book, not to be misinterpreted, the United States doesn't bomb countries because they're inhabited by people of color. But when the United States bombs and engages in warfare against a country inhabited by people of color, it's made easier to initiate and sustain that warfare because the countries are inhabited by people of color. After the murder of George Floyd, we had an upturn, as we should, about discussion of systemic racism. But yet the assumption is systemic racism is only about domestic policy. It makes no sense whatsoever. And it's very difficult to extend the anti-racism ethos and organizing beyond the water's edge in terms of policy. And I think it's essential.
Thanks, Norman. Next up, we have William. I'm going to put you on screen. Go ahead with your question, and just a reminder to keep things brief. We want to get to everyone before we have to close.
Yeah. Hi, Norman.
Hi.
Oh, story. Pleasure. Yeah, what you just said reminded me of John Dower's work, and specifically on the World War II and the virulence of our air campaign against the Japanese versus the air campaign against Germany. For those of you who don't know, I'm a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, so I am familiar with strategic bombing and Air Force policy. Quick question: the nuclear freeze movement. How can we revive that? Because right now, and probably most of you know, the United States is planning to spend up to $2 trillion to so-called modernize our nuclear arsenal. Of course, Daniel Ellsberg wrote about this extensively, and it's always framed in terms of deterrence, and they always talk about investment in nuclear weapons. They don't talk about the genocidal nature of nuclear weapons, and they don't talk about nuclear winter, typically, as you already indicate, Norman. So how do we get back to that? And I'll just bring up real quickly, we have an opportunity this week because of the movie about Oppenheimer that's coming out, which will hopefully raise the consciousness of many people about the dangers of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, thanks. In some ways, similar to how Barack Obama in 2009 chose to make the so-called war on terror bipartisan, which it didn't really have to be. He also furthered the approach to, as you allude to, that euphemized modernization of nuclear weapons was going to be spearheaded now by a Democratic administration, which has been true of all four administrations in this century. Something that is a really tough nut to crack, and it goes to what I was describing earlier about relationships with members of the Progressive Caucus and leadership and so forth, having to do with ICBMs. And as many people know, Dan Ellsberg really emphasized that on hair trigger alert, getting rid of ICBMs, including unilaterally, is the single, he said, best step to reduce the dangers of nuclear war. And unilateral is a dirty word, like diplomacy has become now. But I compare it to two people standing in a deep pool of gasoline, i.e., say, in the Kremlin and the White House. And they're occasionally lighting matches. Well, a sane unilateral action would be for at least one of the two to stop lighting matches. But in our politics, that would be condemned as unilateral disarmament. Right. And there's something particularly the case about ICBMs because they are on hair trigger alert, because they are, unlike the other two parts of the triad, vulnerable to destruction in first attack. Then it's a use them or lose them mentality. Is it a flock of geese? All this sort of thing, especially dangerous. And this is a tie with the conflict in Ukraine, that this refusal to do any serious negotiation. And Jeffrey Sachs spelled this out right after Russia invaded. He wrote in the Financial Times, the US government never engaged in serious diplomacy over the Ukraine crisis as it became very clearly serious. And so when you have this paranoia, this presumably exhaustion in the Kremlin, maybe the White House, that lends itself to the worst aspects of having the land-based part of the triad. So I think that's one element, but these are all mind-boggling realities in terms of nuclear war. And I would just say, and this, I think ICBMs is a really good case in point. Senator Markey and Congressman Ro Khanna, maybe a year and a half ago, introduced a good bill. It was something like the COVID ICBM Act, and it was take $1 billion away from ICBM development and put it towards helping people with COVID. And the long story short, the argument that emerged was that it was too expensive to build the new so-called generation that Northrop Grumman is already slated to get $250 billion for, about 270 billion for. And so it was a money argument. And a lot of very wonderful, well-meaning groups developed a whole website and called it the Money Pit. And they said, we need to stop this because the Minuteman III already in existence doesn't need a new, you could keep the existing ones. And it, on a financial level, seemed to be a good argument. And then Adam Smith, who in one 2-year cycle received $400,000, as I point out in the book, from military contractors, definitely not defense contractors, but military contractors. Adam Smith definitely did an end run. He said, and at this point he was chair of the House Armed Services Committee, he said, well, actually, I've crunched the numbers and it's cheaper to build the new ones than retrofit the old ones. So the entire money pit argument, and not to be over dramatic, but do we want to do a cost analysis for the trains to Auschwitz? I mean, really, this is so beside the point. And we couldn't get members of Congress, including some of the sponsors of this legislation, to say, we're not going to only make a money argument anymore. We're going to make the argument that many people, it's not only Daniel Ellsberg, many others, including William Perry, made in a New York Times op-ed. Yeah. These are, he said, perhaps the most dangerous weapons on the planet. Just get rid of them unilaterally. So This is, just to sort of sum up, this is where if people lead, the leaders will follow. Is the leadership is not going to come from Capitol Hill.
Right. I agree with that.
Thanks, Norman, and thanks, William, for your question. Just to touch on something that you raised, I do think that we have an opportunity to use the release of this big budget film, Oppenheimer, to raise awareness about nuclear disarmament. And if anyone in the audience is interested in doing so, please click this link, and I will send you a flyer that you can actually use to hand out and hopefully get some more advocacy and some more awareness to people. And if you're in the Boston area, I'll print some out and drop them off to you. Speaking of that, I want to bring up our next questioner, Phoebe. Go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Thank you so much, Norm, for your incredible work. It's just a treasure to me as an activist and a human being. I just remember during the war in Vietnam, we used to see body bags on the 6 o'clock news. And my understanding is that the Pentagon realized that, we came out in the streets and shut the war down. So we don't really see any evidence at all here anymore about the suffering that war causes, unless we have a loved one who's a veteran or we're related to someone in the other country. I'm concerned about the government's retaliation and crackdown on people who tell the truth about civilian suffering in U.S. wars, like Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, and some of us who have gotten the truth out about El Salvador and Iraq. And I wonder how much of an impact you think that is having on our ability to educate the population here about what's going on, because I'm sure our population wouldn't put up with it if we knew. So, and I wonder if you have any ideas about what we might be able to do to challenge the government on this issue. Is there any courage in Congress when it comes to standing up to the Pentagon and, encouraging more transparency? I mean, pardon me if that sounds naive, but I'm just looking for a way to see if we can move that mountain. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Phoebe. Well, there's some, I think, there's some indications of courage at some time. I saw 9 Democrats just voted against the, Israel's not a racist country resolution, but it's including Ayanna Pressley in Boston area. But it's tough to find members of Congress who will not only speak truth to power, but speak truth, maybe more importantly, about power and how it's being wielded and so forth. One layer was, as I think you're referring to, when there were a lot of U.S. troops in combat, and then there were arguments about, show their red, white, and blue coffins coming home. No arguments about we don't see the coffins of the people that they killed. Even that, let's say during the first years of the Iraq War, there was awareness that the wars were happening. It was a totally mystified version of what the wars really were. Brief digression. Ashley Banfield, who I chronicle in the book, was destined to be an NBC star during the first time of the War on Terror, and she was being touted to be on Katie Couric's the next Katie Couric anchor. And then she gave one speech, and in an hour, her career was done. She gave a speech at a campus in Manhattan, Kansas, and said there's a difference between coverage and journalism, and just seeing what happens when the missiles are launched is not the whole picture. We're not getting what happens when the U.S. missiles land. And for that, she was denounced by management. She was stuck in a tape closet for 10 months, not let out of her contract. And that's an indicator that even when there was awareness of U.S. troops engaged, the amount of suffering that was really conveyed within the limits of the media, technologies, and so forth was pretty limited. Now it's much worse because there's not even the awareness that Americans are involved in warfare, even though they are more so behind computer consoles in Nevada, or drone strikes and airstrikes in Syria and Somalia, for instance, that aren't reported on, special ops that aren't reported on, even are reported on even less so. So it's a daunting problem. It's a political problem. It's an organizing one. We need to keep messaging. I think speaking truthfully is sort of underrated. I'm not saying rhetorically, but truthfully. Truth should be part of our basic guidelines, our through line. And it's really hard for even our best elected officials to go with. I mean, we belovedly, we appreciate Ro Khanna. He championed the appearance to Congress of Prime Minister Modi from India, a horrible human rights abuser. Why? Because there's a growing effort, which is bipartisan. In some ways, Republicans more into it than Democrats in Congress, because they want to shift some of the attention away from Russia. They want to surround China. And there's outrage that China would have its military vessels in the South China Sea without asking simple questions like, wow, why is the middle name of the South China Sea what it is? I mean, it's like we run the world. And so these questions, not easy, but just to sort of wind up my inadequate response here, we need to develop as best we can, better than we have in the past, clear messaging that is neither considered to be rhetorical nor watered down. And members of Congress, even our allies, they keep watering it down, and we should not do that.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Norman, and thanks, Phoebe, for your question. We're now in overtime. Norman was kind enough to say he could go an extra 15 minutes, so let's try and get as many in as possible. Susan, if you can unmute yourself, it's your turn to ask a question.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking about how wars start, and I thought, you know, they don't just happen, but they're planned years in advance. And when our invasion of Afghanistan ended, it ended so abruptly, and the invasion of Russia in Ukraine started almost immediately. And I thought, well, isn't that beautifully choreographed? And so I think, and of course, all of our attention then went away from ourselves to the other, and we forgot all about ourselves. And I think there's a piece that's missing when we have this dialogue about these interventions. And do they happen together? Is there planning from one to the other? Or how does that happen, that things can be arranged in such a methodical method? Does that make sense?
Well, it's hard to know for sure about sequence of events, but one of the great tragedies, which is rarely mentioned, is that the US response to 9/11 further normalized the prerogative of countries to invade each other, just as the black sites and the torture of the US government after 9/11 also legitimized, to some people, hey, this is okay. So it's like a contagion, or can be like a contagion. And in her great book, Blood Rights, Barbara Ehrenreich describes how wars take on, to use an odd phrase in this context, a life of their own. They become a cause of themselves. And the momentum, it is like a runaway vehicle. The momentum is, aside from all the other factors, very difficult to stop. And one aspects of what the dangers really are that comes to mind is, what are the implications of what Biden decided with the sending of cluster munitions to Ukraine? All of the discussion, and Adam Smith spoke to the Council on Foreign Relations in May, and I was fortunate enough to get a piece at the time in early June into the Hill about this. He said, when he was asked about cluster munitions, and now he's the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, well, it's something I'm open to. We really need to think about it. And the reason he gave we needed to think about it was very much the reason given on the talk shows by the pundits who supported Biden's decision later on, and by spokespeople for the White House and the Pentagon. And that was that the Zelensky government is running out of weapons. And our factories of NATO and the US government are not keeping pace. We're churning out weaponry as fast as we can, but the United States has a hell of a lot of cluster munitions on the shelf. And although they didn't use this term, they're going to waste. Why should we leave them there when we can send them over to Ukraine? Well, why are they doing this? Other than it being lucrative, which I think in this case is not the main reason, it's because they're worried that Russia could win the war otherwise. They're afraid that unless the cluster munitions, even though they were condemned a year earlier by the US government, they're afraid that unless the cluster munitions are sent to Ukraine, Russia could win. Well, my point is this: the US government doctrine and the Russian government doctrine in both cases is that in a so-called conventional war, if our forces are losing, we assert the right and prerogative to be the first to use nuclear weapons in the conflict. So what the US did, and maybe more importantly, the rationale for the US sending these cluster munitions to Ukraine, all of that could also be applied to, by either side, could be applied to, hey, our side's losing, we'd better start using tactical nuclear bombs.
Somehow that's not a good enough explanation.
Susan, I'm gonna, just because we have limited time, get on to the next question. It's a tough question. Nancy, you are up. Let me bring you on the screen.
Thank you. Couple quick things, Mr. Solomon. In answer to what you were talking about racism, would you agree with me when I've often said everybody got on the bandwagon to go support Ukraine? Most of them are white. And I was quite, but they have no trouble where we bombed in Iraq and Yemen.
Sorry, you're referring to the media coverage and so forth?
When you talked about racism and war, yeah. And I just wonder what you would say to my comment that I think the Ukraine is a perfect example. How many people got on board to support the white people in the Ukraine?
Well, everywhere I walk around, and I think this is true quite often, I will see Ukrainian flags, which I don't begrudge. I've not seen a single Yemeni flag.
No.
And the U.S. government, it's not like the U.S. government is a bystander. It's been helping since 2015. Over that period of 7 or 8 years, that killing, as Kevin mentioned, close to 400,000, we're told now, have died as a result of the Saudi-led US-supported war on Yemen. Well, it's partly ideological because not only is it an omission in media coverage that the US is involved, but the fact that the US government is involved makes it a disincentive, a strong disincentive for the coverage. And I have in the book, MSNBC virtually left the Ukraine war unmentioned for years in its coverage while they were doing huge coverage about Russia's evilness. So I think the coverage, if you leave aside all of the political spin and manipulation of history, I think US media coverage that empathizes with and shows the suffering of people in Ukraine, I think it's been terrific. And the contrast with the non-coverage of people who have been massacred by US wars is just huge difference.
Because my understanding is we were bombing Sudan the day that Putin invaded, and I didn't see a bit of coverage or conversation of that. I have though two
Thanks,
other questions.
Nancy. Well, we have a couple of people and only a couple of minutes left. So
Okay. Can I just ask really quickly if you've talked to anyone else? I just was with a reporter friend in DC who worked for AP, and I found myself feeling like I'm a little like the MAGAs, that I don't trust the journalist, I don't trust journalism, and I believe that 9/11, that we deserve.
Nancy, I have to be fair to everybody else. So I'm going to get a rapid fire, sorry to use a military term, but Michael, Mike, Susan, and the gentleman from Majeska, if you could ask your questions in quick succession, and hopefully we'll get a quick comment from Norman before he has to leave. So Michael, go ahead.
Okay, this is Michael Brackney from San Diego. Sorry if my video won't show. Norman, I'm concerned that our call for a ceasefire negotiations is too easy for our government warmongers to dismiss, as they actually are doing. And I think that we need to focus on their admitted war aim of weakening Russia and even bringing about regime change in Russia, and ask them to give that up as as a precondition for negotiations, and that we need to point out that these war aims make it really clear that we're not fighting this proxy war actually to defend Ukraine at all. We're in it for our own reasons. How does this proposal sound to you?
Right.
Well, that information and those perspectives, I think, are not mutually exclusive. And we need a ceasefire. We need negotiations. And there can be some historical analysis and information provided at the same time. The anti-Russia, if I can use the word frenzy, is so intense, it's so ideological driven, it's so baked in at this point that, among other things, we have to emphasize where the endpoint of all this is foreseeable, and that is nuclear war. And presumably, at least some people who have drunk the Russia is our complete enemy Kool-Aid don't want their own kids and grandchildren to be blown up in a nuclear holocaust, one would hope.
Okay, thank you, Norman. We're going to continue the lightning round with Mike. Go for it.
Yes, basically I have a 2-point question. My first part of the question is, do you believe that we actually live in a democracy? Do we not live under an oligarchy that owns and controls nearly all aspects of this nation? They choose two puppets and give us the opportunity to choose between their two choices. And both Dems and Replugs are two wings of the single war party, whose only interest in both of these wings is quest for global hegemony and keeping the war machine going nonstop.
We're in the lightning round, so let's give them a chance to comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that. Definitely, we have an oligarchy in the United States. There are elements of democracy in this country. There's no reason to claim that there are no elements of democracy in the United States. There are totalitarian regimes. I got to visit one in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. We know there are totalitarian governments. This is not a totalitarian government. There are elements of democracy. There are huge systemic, non-democratic, anti-democratic realities in structure. If the two parties don't make any difference, then we should go talk to the women in Texas, for instance, who can't get an abortion now. So and there are zillions of examples. I think, as I said before, conflating in domestic policy the two parties, I think, is just not a credible approach. Whereas in foreign policy, there ain't much difference.
Okay, next we're going to bring up Susan, Susan, go ahead.
Hi. Given your book, War Made Invisible, what do you think about the more recent development of AI work in the military?
Really dangerous. When I did research of the Vietnam War long ago, even in Thailand, the biggest building in Thailand was a very rudimentary form of AI where they were putting camouflage droppings along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and then automatically sending in bombers there. Well, I mean, that's hardly even qualified, but just to say this is of a piece. It depends on who controls the technology, as Herbert Marcuse said. So very dangerous. This is all the automated warfare just makes it all more ominous.
Thanks. And I will now bring up the final question, Jessica from Eugene, Oregon.
Thank you. This is Todd Boyle. Hello, Norman.
Hi.
So I've had great success in arguing with people against the Iraq war that none of the wars since World War II have been self-defense. None of the Iraqis ever attacked America. No Vietnamese ever attacked America. No Koreans ever. However, there is a very influential faction in the U.S. policy establishment that if the U.S. does not prevent the emergence of a superpower in the Eurasian landmass, this originated during World War II, then they would eventually be big enough that they would be an existential threat to the United States. And that is still enshrined in the defense doctrine, at least it was during the Bush administration. So my question is this: is that really true today under the present circumstances, that it's important for the US to prevent the emergence of or for example, prevent Russia from consolidating power across Europe and the Chinese from consolidating power across Asia? Is that really an existential threat to us? That's my question.
I think,
Go ahead, Norman.
yeah, I think it hinges on what we mean by us. The elites, certain elites, yeah, they have their own concerns. We have our own. Our stake in the planet is to have a multipolar, not unipolar world, to have one where ecological protection and nutrition and healthcare is good and that diplomacy really matters. Whereas, for instance, at the end of War Made Invisible, I have some quotes from Hillary Clinton, for instance, but it's a bipartisan idea. And that is that the United States is, quote, an indispensable nation to the world. And my comment is that that's a complete fantasy. It's a jingo narcissistic, solipsistic craziness at this point. The US is 4% of the world's population. And in many ways, the US gets on, or the world gets on just fine without the United States, trade in all sorts of different ways. And the United States is largely an impediment. The United States is an indispensable nation to itself. And so the pathway along the road is which version of us is going to prevail.
Thanks for that, Norman, and thanks for taking so much time to answer all those questions. I want to hand it back over to our moderator, Susan, with the final word.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Thank you so much, Norman, for coming and talking with us about your book and answering questions. And, I see that there are still people out there who have questions to be asked and answered. And I see questions in the chat about various things. To let you all know that there will be a YouTube video of this that will come out, a follow-up, and it will have information about purchasing Norman's book, and also about various action items that you can take advantage of. You've raised so many interesting points, and we certainly need to figure out all the ways that we can make war visible and that we can act on it. And you've certainly opened that up for us. So thank you, Norman, and thank you to all who have participated in this program.
Thanks, everybody.